It really.
Sign-in sheet from my PMCS class.
It's charged, actually.
Right.
That's a really good idea. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, definitely.
Hello. Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Policy Pulse panel. Thank you so much for coming. This event is part of National Voter Education Week and is being sponsored by the Office of Student Life and the Annual Humanities Program. The theme of this year's Humanities Program is Stories That Shape Us, which takes a deep dive into the powerful influence that storytelling has on our perceptions of ourselves, others, and the world. This program has been made possible through a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities and funding from generous donors. My name is Megan Nosek, and I am the Annual Humanities Program Director. Nikolai Blihar, the Assistant Director of Student Life and Leadership, and I have been working together over the past few months to plan this event. And Nikolai will be providing the concluding remarks to bring the panel to a close today. So this event was created to provide a nonpartisan overview of some key political topics that are currently affecting and have critical implications for the American people. In a society where myths and disinformation run rampant and are being used as persuasion tactics, it is imperative to seek the truth. And that often requires challenging our own beliefs and challenging what we're being told.
The panelists joining us today have developed expertise for dedicated learning and practice in their respective fields, and we are so grateful for their participation in this event. We hope that you will keep an open mind and think critically about the issues being discussed during today's panel. Each panelist will spend about 10 to 15 minutes providing an overview of their topic. And once all panelists have spoken, there will be a short break for lunch. Bagged lunches have been provided for participants through Sodexo. And during lunch, there will be an informal Q&A session where participants will have the opportunity to sit with panelists and discuss topics in greater depth over lunch. So before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our first panelist. Joe Welsh is a founder and executive director of the Lehigh Valley Justice Institute. As such, he manages Institute operations and is the public spokesperson for the Institute. Previously, Joe spent 15 years as a civil rights attorney litigating police misconduct and prison condition cases. For 6 years, Mr. Welsh served on the board of directors of the Pennsylvania ACLU. In 2012, he received the prestigious ACLU PA Torchbearer Award for his work fighting voter suppression efforts. Mr. Welsh spent decades managing political and social justice campaigns in several states. He has also served as a consultant to state and local governments. He is an international election observer, having participated in missions in Ukraine and most recently Uzbekistan. In addition to ACLU, Joe's work has earned him awards from the U.S. Department of Justice and the local media. Joe holds a Bachelor of Arts in Government, summa cum laude from Lehigh University, and a Juris Doctor from the Northwestern School of Law. Mr. Welsh will be speaking on the topic of social justice.
Thank you very much. Is this working? Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here and for your interest. I might add one more thing to that resume that just occurred to me overnight. I first voted in the Pennsylvania primary in May of 1974. And I have voted in every primary and general election since then. And, you know, you look at some of the coverage of elections and it's kind of like you're watching a football game. And, oh, did they get a first down? Did they get a punch in? Did they do this? But you know what? You walk into that voting booth and you press a button for a candidate, you're doing something vitally important. And you're part of a group of people who want to determine who's going to run our country or run our state or run our local governments. That is so powerful. And I'm assuming and I'm hoping that you all will be voting this year. And I say, just think about that as you leave the polling place. Just think about what you just did when you went in there and you voted. Because there are lots of places in the world, and I've been to some, where you don't have a choice. You may appear to have a choice, but you really don't. So it's just very important, and I ask you to keep that in mind. Has anybody here heard of the Lehigh Valley Justice Institute? This is always my humbling moment. We were formed in the wake of the lynching of George Floyd. We were formed in October of 2020. And what we had seen was this massive outpouring of energy and a very diverse group of people on the streets protesting what had happened and more generally addressing issues of social justice. And we wanted to take that energy, saw out on the streets, and we wanted to start channeling it into some really solid data-driven research on criminal justice issues right here in the Lehigh Valley. And we're very much focused on finding local solutions to issues within our criminal justice system in the Lehigh Valley. But even though we're focused on the Lehigh Valley, we believe that local solutions that we can develop here are going to be portable and can be taken to other areas throughout the country because, as you might have noticed from the election coverage, the Lehigh Valley is a microcosm for the country. We have all sorts of demographic groups represented. We have urban areas, we've got suburban areas, and we've got rural areas. So if we can get consensus building here on local solutions, there's really no reason why they can't be taken elsewhere. Now, an early project we looked at, obviously just after the George Floyd lynching, was police use of force. And so we provided to all of the police departments in the Lehigh Valley 3 different models on how they can, in real time or in monthly, weekly, whatever they want to do, report on use of force incidents in their department. And we got some pushback, needless to say, from a number of departments. But interestingly, the Allentown police chief, representing the largest department in the Lehigh Valley, is working on doing this on the Allentown police website. So shortly, we will have real-time disclosure of use of force incidents. Now, he's adopted a model from the New York Police Department that also reports use of force against officers. But we'll take that trade-off as long as we're getting the transparency and the disclosure on use of force by officers. So what we do is we try to take an academic level research approach to produce some real world results. That one was one of them. We've also developed an expertise in geospatial analysis. And what geospatial analysis allows you to do, it allows you to take data points and match them up with geographies. And once you do that, you can then start bringing in all of the data that's in the census, from the Census Bureau, in the American Community Survey, and you can start looking at the characteristics on a neighborhood by neighborhood level and matching that up to justice data and seeing what neighborhoods and what demographics are most impacted by various processes in the criminal justice system. We do a lot of this work, and we're able to do a lot of this work because we have a very robust internship program. And if I can put in a plug, we will be here tomorrow for the BAC Internship Career Fair. And so please stop by and visit us if you're here tomorrow. Now, what we learned very early is you can't talk about criminal justice in the abstract. You can't say, okay, well, let's do this about cash bail, let's do this in use of force, et cetera, et cetera. You've really got to look at the larger social justice issues that drive the criminal justice system. Some examples: housing, employment, education, and particularly mental health. So with respect to housing, the Lehigh County commissioners were interested in doing something about the eviction crisis. Post-COVID, when the eviction moratorium ended, eviction cases skyrocketed all over the country and obviously here in both counties. And we took a look at 10 years worth of landlord-tenant cases. And now there was a general notion that tenants don't fare well in landlord-tenant court. What we found out was tenants win 0.9% of all cases. Meaning if you had 1,000 tenants out there on the campus, 9 of them would win. And I will wager that's because the landlord forgot to show up. So we demonstrated the imbalance in the system. And the funny thing is, I saw 1 or 2 of you nod when I said the 0.9%. That's the reaction we got from the commissioners. Is when you put a number on it, somehow the general notion becomes real. And that's part of the basis for our data-driven approach. The end result of that study was the commissioners put a new line item in the county budget and appropriated $200,000 as a start for eviction relief programs, including some legal assistance to families facing evictions. Now, what does housing have to do with criminal justice? One example. Janine Donati, who is the Director of Corrections at Lehigh County, for Lehigh County, estimates that at any given time, she has 50 people in Lehigh County Jail eligible for release, but they don't have a permanent address to be released to. So they are literally sitting in jail for lack of housing. Another area that we looked at was mental health in the schools. How many here have heard of the school to prison pipeline? Okay. We started looking at how do we start shutting down that pipe, closing the valve on it, as we put it. And we realized that mental health is a major driver of school to prison pipeline. And we found a very innovative program by Dr. Harrison Bailey right here in Bethlehem, Liberty High School, where he has a wellness center. In fact, it used to be the in-school suspension room, and he has turned it into a wellness center. He has 3 full-time counselors, and he treated last year over 700 students just at one high school. The shocking statistic that we found in this study was on something called the PAYS survey, which is an anonymous statewide survey of middle and high school students. On this anonymous survey in the Lehigh Valley, 1 in 12 students reported that they had taken an act in furtherance of a suicide plan. 1 in 12. Obviously, we need to do a lot of work on mental health and mental health in the schools. One side effect of our report is it was used by Community Action of Lehigh Valley to persuade Allentown City Council to appropriate $1 million toward a youth center in Allentown. So what we're really finding is mental health and criminal justice really coincide and collide. And a couple of areas where that happens, the school to prison pipeline, which I just discussed, also in policing. Once again, we're blessed with a very progressive person in the city of Bethlehem, Michelle Cott, who is the police chief. And I used to say she's one of the 10 most progressive police chiefs in the country. Harvard University vindicated me by making her one of the 10 that they sent to Denver to study their mental health co-responder. She is building out quietly and methodically a robust public safety response that includes not only police, but mental health professionals. And she also has her department taking a very proactive approach to community problems and referring people over to appropriate social service agencies when they go out on nuisance calls within neighborhoods. Finally, a major issue of mental health and criminal justice is mental health in the jails. And I was at a symposium a few months ago down at Penn. One of the panelists said something that really stuck with me, which is, if you go to virtually any county in the United States of America and you ask, where is the largest mental health treatment facility? You know what it'll end up being? You want to take a guess?
Yeah.
A county jail. The absolute worst place to be doing mental health treatment. So we're advocating for much more robust mental health treatment and also combining it with the reentry process, because upwards of 95% of everyone in jail will be reentering the community at some point. And so what are the support structures that are going to be in place to help them with that reentry? And we believe that that should be integrated into the jail itself, so that while people are in jail, they are already getting the assistance that they need, and they're being teamed up with the people who do that out in the community. Now, you may tell me, okay, well, this is all very interesting, and this will make a nice government class or something, but what does it have to do with me? Oh, I don't know anybody who was involved in the criminal justice system. I don't know anybody with mental health issues. Do, but you might say you don't. I don't know anybody who's experiencing housing insecurity. I don't know anybody who's experiencing food insecurity. Why should I care about this? Well, here's why you should care. Billions and billions of dollars are being spent every year on a system of mass incarceration. That's your money being spent in your name. And the question that I have for you is, do you think you're really getting the bang for the buck that you should be getting for all the money you're spending of your tax money? I think most people would agree the answer is no. In fact, it's actually the one thing that everybody seems to agree upon in the criminal justice reform system, reform issues. So if you start looking at the numbers, there's actually a study out of the University of Florida that economic impact of the system of mass incarceration is 6% of GDP. And GDP is the sum total of all the goods and services that are produced by an economy. In the Lehigh Valley, that would translate to an economic impact of $2 billion a year. Now, we set out on the venture to document this, and we've so far documented $800 million in economic impact in Lehigh Valley based on our justice system. What that is lost opportunities. It can be interpreted as lower taxes. But what it also is, the economy taking that kind of hit, $800 million a year, that could be the job that you won't get because it doesn't exist. Or that could be the house that you won't buy because it doesn't exist. So, now that I got your attention, hopefully, what are you going to do about it? Oh, well, first step, if you're not registered, or you know somebody who's not registered, get them registered today. Even if they say, oh, I don't care, they're all nonsense, I'm not voting for any of them, whatever. They may hear something between now and November 5th that triggers them and says, oh my God, I wish I was registered so I could vote. So step one, register. Step two is to vote. But before you vote, get some real information. Okay, don't look at TikTok. Really research matters that concern you and get some real information. And then, of course, get your friends to vote. If you really feel energetic, you could work on a campaign. We have a very close House of Representatives race right here in the 7th District of Pennsylvania that could very well decide whether Democrats or Republicans run the House of Representatives. So that's one opportunity. And finally, if you really get excited about this stuff, run for office yourself. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Welsh. Okay, our next panelist is Yuli Santamella. She has been a certified medical assistant at the Allentown Women's Center for almost 4 years. She works primarily frontline jobs at the clinic where she schedules patients for desired services, performs ultrasounds, assists the medical director with minor procedures, and counsels patients needing additional help post-procedure. Julie has attended several conferences hosted by the National Abortion Federation over the years, where she has attained further training and knowledge on abortion care to better help assist patients at the practice. And Yuli will be speaking on the topic of reproductive health and rights. Welcome, Yuli.
So much, Megan, for that. So yes, I am a medical assistant. I work at the Allentown Women's Center, where we are a private clinic located in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. We at AWC provide compassionate and reproductive healthcare and wellness services. We support patients in making decisions that are best for them in an environment where no one is to be judged for their choices. And we also believe that having access to safe, supportive, and expert medical services for personal healthcare choices is a basic human right. At AWC, we provide a few services, including abortion care, both procedures with or without anesthesia, depending on the comfortability of the patient, and of course, the abortion pill. We also are in abortion care training. We are actually one of only 3 centers of excellence for abortion training in the US. We also provide pregnancy options and counseling, GYN preventative services like pap smears, routine care, problem care visits, and birth control, gender affirming, and as well as medical marijuana certifications and renewals. AWC is a member of 2 national professional abortion associations, the first being the National Abortion Federation, or as we call it, NAF, and the others Abortion Care Network, or ACN. These groups have strict requirements for membership, and it is very important that when you are seeking any abortion care, that you go to a member clinic to ensure that you're receiving the highest level of care. Also, because of our membership with NAF, we can offer financial assistance for patients struggling to cover the full cost of their abortion. We work with a number of funding agencies to help lower the cost of said abortion for low-income and at-risk patients, such as minors, unhoused patients, and those in situations involving intimate partner abuse. Unintended pregnancy is a continuing reality for American people. According to 2020 abortion rates, approximately 1 in 4 people with a uterus are expected to have an abortion by the age of 45. We strongly believe that abortion care is healthcare and that we need to keep it legal, safe, and accessible. A little history on the US. The US was established in 1776. Abortion was not an issue of significant controversy. People actually followed the traditional Protestant Christian belief that personhood or lifehood began at quickening, which is when the mother actually felt the baby move somewhere between about 18 to 21 weeks of pregnancy. However, by the mid-1800s, all states had laws to restrict abortion, with exceptions in some states if a doctor said that the abortion was needed to save the life of the patient or because of health or therapeutic reasons. By 1910, abortion was illegal at every stage in pregnancy in every state in the country. These abortion bans had some exceptions and instances to save the patient's life, a decision that only doctors, 95% of whom were men, had the power to make. Criminalizing abortion sent the practice underground, and which resulted in high death tolls. Estimates of the number of illegal abortions in the 1950s to 1960s ranged anywhere from 200,000 to about 1.2 million per year. In 1965, illegal abortion accounted for 17% of all deaths attributed to pregnancy and childbirth. And these are just the numbers that were officially reported. So actual numbers were most likely much higher. In the 1960s, states began reforming their strict anti-abortion laws. That by 1973, 5 states, including Alaska, Hawaii, New York, California, and Washington, had repealed their abortion bans entirely. But in all other states, abortion was basically illegal, except in instances of rape, incest, or to save the mother's life. Abortion was actually illegal in Pennsylvania. As you can see, we're the only blacked out state there, completely illegal with no exceptions. In 1973, in Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution protected abortion as a fundamental right prior to fetal viability. After that point, a state could restrict or ban abortion as long as there was an exception to protect a patient's life and health. However, on June 24th, 2022, the Supreme Court case Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health overturned prior Roe v. Wade, ruling that there is no federal constitutional right to abortion, allowing states to severely restrict or ban abortion care. This actually marked the first time in American history that a fundamental right was taken away by the Supreme Court. So, which brings me to abortion regulation today in the US in 2024, map that shows post-Dobbs decision. All dark red states have banned abortion completely. The lighter red states have a near total ban of about 6 weeks. Now, biologically speaking, a patient, by the time they miss their period, they are already considered to be about 4 weeks pregnant. And a pregnancy actually isn't detected on an ultrasound until about 5 weeks. So it doesn't really much leave time to organize an abortion or really make any plan of any sort. So abortion is now banned in a larger part of the US, as you can see. Abortion is still legal in Pennsylvania for up to 24 weeks of gestation. However, abortions can still be difficult to obtain because of rules and regulations that were enacted by the Pennsylvania General Assembly when Republicans had the majority in the Senate and House. In Pennsylvania in 1982, the Republican-controlled House and Senate passed the Abortion Control Act, or as we know it, the ACA, which requires that that a doctor speaks to a patient about their alternatives to an abortion. Then they must wait a full 24 hours before actually getting any type of abortion they desire. Not only is this requirement very patronizing because there are no laws requiring men to wait 24 hours to be sure that their decision before getting a procedure, but it can also be very inconvenient for many patients. We've had patients who have missed their calls in the past from the doctor because they were at work or it was simply inconvenient, and then they would have to reschedule their appointment to a later time. This meant that they were further along in their gestation, and it also may have increased the price of their procedure, imposing further hardship on the patient. I do want to point out that neighboring states do not have this requirement. The ACA also makes it difficult for minors or patients under the age of 18. Instead of requiring a phone call with the doctor, minors must be physically seen in person and to bring a parent or guardian with proper identification, being photo IDs for both the minor and attending parent, and a birth certificate to prove that the parent or guardian is indeed involved with the minor. Following that initial visit, they must then wait 24 hours before returning to the facility with the same parent to then go through an actual termination process. This, as you can imagine, can be very taxing for both the minor and the parent. The minor is essentially missing 2 days of school, and the parent has to take off work or pay for childcare for other children. In addition, many patients live hours from the clinic, so requiring 2 physical in-person trips to the clinic also increases travel costs. In the case where the minor's parent will not give consent or simply can't attend both visits with the minor will have to go through a process, what we call a judicial bypass. So this is where they must appear before a county judge and show that they are responsible enough to decide for themselves that they do indeed want an abortion. This, if you think about it, is a pretty ludicrous requirement, considering that if the judge deems that the patient is not responsible enough to choose an abortion for themselves, then they will be forced to carry the pregnancy to term. And if they're not mature enough to make a decision about their own bodies, how could they possibly be mature enough to have a child? This long drawn out process takes a toll on both the patient and any parties involved. Again, I do want to reiterate that neighboring states do not have these requirements for minors. They actually can obtain an abortion without parental consent or a judicial bypass. And lastly, trap laws. So in the early 2000s, states began instituting difficult and irrelevant licensing requirements known as targeted regulation of abortion, or trap laws, which have nothing to do with protecting health and everything to do with shutting down abortion clinics. In Pennsylvania in 2011, when both chambers of the legislature were controlled by Republicans and we had a Republican governor, Pennsylvania passed regulations in 3 different areas. The first being where they require abortion facilities to have the same regulations as an ambulatory surgical center. Even though these centers provide more invasive and risky procedures than abortions and typically use higher levels of sedation that are not commonly provided in abortion clinics. These regulations include requirements for parking lot designs, hallway widths, recovery room structures, and plumbing and ventilation systems. So compliance for our clinic at AWC alone cost about $500,000. Unfortunately, this requirement caused 5 clinics in Pennsylvania to actually shut down. The Pennsylvania trap laws also require abortion facilities to have a registered nurse present when procedures are being done in the clinic, and a doctor is not allowed to fill this requirement. It has to be a registered nurse. And lastly, regulations also require Pennsylvania abortion clinics to comply with pediatric care requirements, even though by definition, abortion patients are not children. Such trap laws have actually been denounced by medical organizations like the American Medical Association and the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. So brings us to what we can do about it. We can get out and register first and vote. We do need everyone possible who's able to vote, just vote. And if you think your vote doesn't matter, I promise you at the end of the day, it does. We do need a Democratic majority in the Pennsylvania House and Senate to appeal provisions of the ACA and trap laws. And we need Democrats in the White House and the US House and Senate to enact a federal constitutional right to abortion and reproductive rights. And lastly, we can talk about it, get the word out, encourage others to vote. If you do believe that we have the right to choose, then you should consider voting Democrats, but I do have a flyer that shows all candidates' positions on abortion if anyone would like one. Thank you for your support.
Thank you so much, Julie. Our next panelist is Anna Smith. Anna was born and raised in South Bethlehem, where she currently lives with her husband and 2 children. An advocate for neighborhood-driven, asset-based community development and housing justice, she served as Director of Community Action Development Bethlehem from 2016 to 2020, and from January 2023 to the present. Ms. Smith is a graduate of Tufts University with a Bachelor's of Arts in Economics, American Studies, and Spanish, and received an MSED in Education, Culture, and Society from the University of Pennsylvania. Anna will be speaking on the topic of cost of living.
And thanks so much for the opportunity to be here today, and for your interest in all of these topics, in what is probably the most important election of all of our lifetimes. So my name's Anna. I work at Community Action. We are an anti-poverty organization that was founded in the 1960s as part of the federal government's commitment to a war on poverty throughout the US. And so we were founded to address issues of poverty here in Lehigh and Northampton counties through a variety of different programs. Since the 1960s, those have kind of shifted depending on what the particular needs of our community are at any given moment in time. These days, we are talking about housing as one of our biggest issues here in the Lehigh Valley, but we also provide support to small businesses. Second Harvest Food Bank of Lehigh Valley is part of our larger community action structure. And we run a number of neighborhood programs as well, focused on downtown Allentown, South Bethlehem, where I work and lead that program, and then also up in the Slate Belt, in some of the more rural areas of northern Northampton County. And so I'm going to be talking about cost of living today, which is on a lot of polls these days, kind of the biggest issue we're seeing voters say that they care about and that they're using to determine who they're voting for. And so first, I just want to ask, how many people in this room, either yourselves or a family member or a close friend, has ever struggled with figuring out how they're going to pay the bills at the end of the month? Yeah, I think pretty much everyone, right? And so I want to, echo something that Joe said in his remarks that, we know these stories, right? We hear from our family members, our friends in our own lives. We know what it's like to figure out how you're going to pay for your housing, how you're going to pay your electric bill and not get it shut off, some of those tough decisions that we're making throughout the month. And so what I'm going to focus on a little bit today is some of the numbers, some of the data behind that to show that those stories that have affected us so deeply are, really common stories with a lot of numbers to back them up, and that are affecting far more people in our community than we may even know. So, I want to talk about what it costs to live here. So there's something out there called the federal poverty line, which is our official definition of poverty in this country. And according to that, which is supposed to kind of calculate an average across the US of what it takes to afford the basic necessities to get by, that says that about 11% of Americans live, below that line and are struggling with poverty. And that's the number for Northampton County as well, about 11%. But when we hear 11%, if every single person in this room said they know someone, that sounds awfully low. And so what I wanted to share with you guys is something that United Way of the Lehigh Valley has put together, which is what they call the actual household survival budget for living in the Lehigh Valley right now. So, according to the federal poverty line, about $30,000 a year for a family of 4 is sufficient to get by in this country. But if we look at the numbers that real families, that our families, that you guys in the Lehigh Valley are paying these days to survive for all of these basic expenses, you'll see that those numbers are actually much, much higher. And so, if you take a look here at a family like mine with 2 adults and 2 kids, you can see major expenses, housing, childcare, certainly, food, transportation, tax payments, these all add up to a survival wage for that family of over $50 an hour. If you have 2 adults working in the family, that's still $25 an hour. Anyone know what the minimum wage in Pennsylvania is?
$7.25.
$7.25. So here, $25 if you have 2 adults working in that family. If you're just a single adult, it's a little bit lower. You're not paying for childcare. You don't have some of those additional expenses, but $17.39 is a whole lot more than that $7.25 an hour. And folks may know that, a lot of the businesses around here in the Lehigh Valley have opted to pay a higher wage. There are folks paying $12, $15 an hour. For years, we heard, $15 an hour, that living wage. I think we fought so long for that number and argued so long for it that, the numbers have changed. And now even for a single adult, we're looking at, substantially more than $15 an hour just for your basic survival budget. And you'll notice there's things missing here too, right? Where's actually going out and doing something for fun? Where's getting a gift for your kids? Where is paying for student loans? Those aren't even included here in your basic survival budget. Here you will see if we look at Northampton County alone, and the numbers are almost identical for Lehigh County, about half of our households are making less than that survival wage and that survival budget to get by. So I think for me, at least, when I'm thinking about what it means, what anti-poverty work means, what it means to give people, a chance, an opportunity to provide for their families, to not have to struggle and be stressed out at the end of the month. Over half, just about half of our community members are dealing with that stress and that struggle every single day, right here in the Lehigh Valley. And that amounts to, just in Northampton County, over 57,000 households that are not making that survival wage. Go to the next slide here. These numbers have changed over time. This has not always been the case here in the Lehigh Valley. The ALICE line up here is the number of those families. They call it ALICE, which is asset limited, income constrained, employed, just a technical term to mean essentially folks who are typically fully employed, but just not making the wage that's sufficient to cover that survival budget. And you will see there's a big jump in recent years. And I'm going to talk in a second about what some of those factors have been, particularly here in the Lehigh Valley, that have made it that much harder to make ends meet and have increased the cost of living. So, a couple of the drivers here of economic inequality, we'll jump through a few. I'm kind of going to give a little bit of an overview of what some of these things are. And then we're certainly, when we have lunch, happy to dive more into it. I'd love to hear you guys' perspectives on some of these things as well. We just saw earlier in the presentation, true living wages in our community are more than double the minimum wage in Pennsylvania. And while we did see some wage growth among earners at the lower end of the spectrum during the pandemic, for a little bit, since then, many of those increases have leveled off. And if you want to go to the next slide, you can see, there's this little peak there around 2020 where wages went up, and then since have, leveled off back down. Those were not permanent increases. You can also see on this graph, I think this is really interesting, since the 1980s, the top line there are the top 10% of earners in this country. You can see how much over these decades, wages have gone up. But when you look at folks on the lower end of the earning spectrum, you'll see that wages have barely increased since the 1980s for our lowest level of earners, while folks at the top, wages have gone up and up and up. So, as expenses have increased, wages have not kept pace. And, when wages don't cover the cost of basic needs, we see fully employed families that are dependent on federal benefits like Medicaid, like SNAP benefits that are designed to help folks who are going through emergencies typically, or who, are unable to work full time. These programs are subsidizing our major employers, folks who are working at Walmart, folks who are working in an Amazon warehouse. But instead of the employer paying that full wage, you're having residents who are dependent on these benefits to be able to get by, and to be able to, afford their basic expenses at the end of the month. So employers that have made substantial gains in productivity since the 1980s have not passed those benefits on to our to the average worker. And, you know, there are many cases looking to the government to pick up the bill for what they are not paying to their employees. I also want to highlight the high cost of childcare here, which is a major factor in the employment decisions of families with children. So, you know, as we saw earlier on, while the $18 survival wage may cover the basic needs of a single individual, families with children face a very different economic calculation. Even the two-income family would require that $25 an hour wage for each earner to make ends meet. And childcare is up there with housing as the most significant expense for families with children. For families, you know, like mine, who we were lucky and we got a home with a low interest rate, we were able to buy a home. And my childcare expenses for 2 kids are more than double what I pay in my housing expenses. While many countries have opted to subsidize early childhood education and make those economic calculations a lot easier for families with small children, subsidies in the US are extremely limited. And most families are left, you know, shopping for childcare on a private market. And if anyone saw the vice presidential debate last night, childcare came up there as well. And there was a really interesting conversation about what some of those potential solutions could be to relieve that pressure on families with small children and making some of those tough choices about, you know, where to send their kids, about quality care, and about pursuing employment. And so the next one that I mentioned here, the kind of social safety net. So what supports do we provide to individuals who are facing challenges making ends meet? I think, you know, we hear regularly throughout our society about how one health emergency can send a family who's just getting by into a major crisis. Joe talking about evictions here. How many evictions are the result of someone getting sick and racking up medical bills, missing a couple weeks of work, and then family can plunge into crisis for weeks, months, often years at a time. We have very limited resources to address those accumulating medical bills and medical expenses. And while we do have programs at the federal level like SNAP or food stamps, Medicaid, subsidized housing, which are really essential and provide a lifeline for many families, much of our government's investment in social spending is actually directed at those who are most economically stable, in the form of child tax credits, mortgage interest deductions, college savings plans. We spend more on social programs than any country except France, but the bulk of our spending is not going to the folks who need it the most, the folks who are struggling to make minimum wage. If you actually look at the numbers and where the subsidies are going, they're tending to go to the higher earners within our society, the way that our tax code and programs are structured. And, you know, where funding is directed at those most in need through programs like SNAP and TANF, which is the Cash Assistance Program, also formerly known as welfare, there's a lot of red tape and bureaucracy that can make it extraordinarily challenging for families to receive assistance. For example, nearly half of seniors who are eligible for SNAP benefits do not receive them because of the red tape associated with getting those benefits or the lack of knowledge that they're eligible for them. And when it comes to actual investment in what we would call formerly call welfare or cash assistance, nationally, only 22 cents out of every dollar that is spent on those welfare programs actually makes it into the pockets of our neediest families. 22 cents of every dollar. The rest of that money, states are doing things like paying professional football players to give speeches on family values. They've been given discretion to spend those funds how they want, and they are not going into the pockets of needy families. And so, you know, one of the really interesting things that happened during the pandemic was that we had a really unique test case for a different type of social spending and providing assistance to families who were facing emergencies during the pandemic. We had direct cash payments for families with children through an expanded tax credit. If anyone here has kids, you all of a sudden got money deposited into your account every month and cut out any red tape. It put cash directly in the hands of families who needed it. And the studies have shown that it worked. If you go back to the previous slide, sorry, I'm like jumping all over the place. You can see that when that spending hit, that extended child tax credit, child poverty in the US plummeted to the lowest level in generations because we put cash in the hands of people who needed it. And what did they spend it on? Food, school supplies, childcare, housing, all of those items that make up that survival budget, when families received that funding, when they were in crisis, it allowed child poverty to drop and it allowed families to spend on what they needed to survive. Unfortunately, those were not permanent. And you can see here that child poverty has almost reached pre-pandemic levels. This is a big issue in this election. You know, a lot of folks are talking about an expanded child tax credit, if that's something, you know, that we could possibly pass in the future. So also something worth paying attention to, because it was one of the most impactful programs that we've had in terms of reducing child poverty. Finally, the last thing that I just wanted to mention, and probably the one that I get to do the most work on in the day-to-day, my day-to-day, is our housing crisis and our housing market, which has changed profoundly since the start of the pandemic here in the Lehigh Valley. I have just a few stats just from the city of Bethlehem, where I do most of my work, to show how drastically it's changed and how challenging that's been for families, particularly who rent their homes. So you can see the median rent was about $1,300 prior to the pandemic. And then these are 2023 figures, $1,900 a month. That is an astounding jump. Nobody's wages came even close to increasing that much, if they increased at all. When I go to the next one, we also have home sale prices. So for those who are looking to buy a home, 182,000 was fairly affordable with lower interest rates for, you know, folks of a lot of different income levels. But once it jumped to 302,000, you're looking here with current interest rates of a mortgage payment of over $2,000 every month, which is out of reach for the majority of the families in our community. So buying a home has become a lot more challenging. And I think throughout all of this, something that I've you know, neglected to mention, but I think that is really essential, is to highlight the racial and ethnic disparities in every single one of these topics that we've talked about. And in home ownership and renting, you can see that throughout, this is specifically Bethlehem data, renters were the hardest hit by the housing crisis, continue to be the hardest hit by the housing crisis. If you have a mortgage, you're kind of locked in if you own your home. But if you're renting, your landlord can just decide at the end of your lease, hey, I'm gonna up your rent $600 a month because I can. Who is the hardest hit by that in the Lehigh Valley is our Black and Latino families. And that is a massive racial disparity that has, you know, ongoing impacts on so many other aspects of folks and family stability. Whereas, you know, white families own, about 63% of white families own their homes in Bethlehem. So massive disparity here that has its roots in a history of kind of structural discrimination in our system. And then let's see, I think I have one last slide. and so, you know, just another impact of this crisis in our housing market is really who can actually afford to live here and what is the impact going to be on our local economy. And, you know, many of the most common occupations in our community that are essential to supporting our families, to supporting our healthcare, whether it's home healthcare workers, retail, food service workers, all of these folks who are essential workers would need to earn more than $40,000 more per year to actually be able to afford even a 1-bedroom apartment in the city of Bethlehem right now. And 16 out of the 20 most common occupations in Bethlehem cannot afford to rent a home of any size within the city of Bethlehem. That's including folks like nurses, like teachers, folks who are essential to the economic success of our community moving forward. And so I think these, a lot of us have felt this, have seen these realities in our own lives, talking with friends, talking with family members, struggling to pay the rent, to find an affordable apartment. And these, you know, this is not just a reality, you know, for each one of us. This is really becoming, unfortunately, a universal experience here in our Lehigh Valley as things have changed so drastically since the pandemic. And so all of these issues are, you know, at the top of the list in terms of the candidates this year, whether it's at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level. And so I'd urge you to, you know, pay attention to what folks are saying about cost of living, about housing, about social programs when you're making decisions about who you want to vote for. So thank you so much. Thanks for the
Thank you so much, Anne. Our final panelist is Dr. Jennifer Mayberry. Dr. Mayberry is an associate professor of journalism at Temple University's Klein College of Media and Communication. Her research explores how journalism can be improved in ways that yield more ethical reporting on marginalized groups and that more effectively evoke audience empathy and engagement with important social issues. Within that theme, one branch of her scholarship examines how journalism of vulnerable populations can perpetuate dangerous stereotypes. In a second branch, she investigates how reporting on gun violence can be practiced in a way that is less extractive and harmful. Previous to her career in academia, she worked for the Philadelphia Daily News, the Associated Press, AOL News, and NBC News. Dr. Mayberry will be speaking on the topic of gun violence in the media.
Hey, everybody, thank you so much for being here. So I am gonna be talking to you, I'm gonna give you a little bit of information just to sort of set the stage and to give you some statistics and context for sort of what the US is facing in terms of a gun violence epidemic. But what I'm gonna focus most on in the talk is really how we talk about this issue. And I'm going to propose to you that the way that this issue is discussed in news is something that affects the way all of us in this room understand what gun violence is, what type of a problem it is, and it affects the type of solutions that we can imagine to deal with the topic. So in 2021, President Biden he declared gun violence to be an epidemic and started really talking about it in terms of not just crime, but in another manner. So raise your hand if when I say gun violence, you think of it as a type of problem that is categorized as a crime problem. Okay. Anybody else characterize it a different way? What kind of a problem is it if it's not a crime?
I think there's multiple parts. One is the crime, but it's also society. I think there's a lot of normalization of it, a lot of influence as far like, for example, music and pop culture. I think it recklessly uses the symbol of guns, kind of desensitizes people to it. So especially the younger generations, I think they don't, myself included, we don't have the same level of appreciation and respect for weapons as probably our grandparents did, just because it's always in our face all over the place. And so it's like, it's not that division anymore that we used to have.
So it's a social issue. Any word that you can think of to take that really nuanced answer you gave and just smush it into an oversimplified word? It's not crime. Think about it. I'll come back to you. Yes.
So, I see it to be two things. One is, education. And the second would be access to mental health care.
Okay, good. Nice and concise. How would you characterize it?
I characterize it, well, focusing on the second word, which is violence. It's a epidemic of violence. I think,
This isn't crime?
well, no, it is crime, but I just want to focus on it because it's because there is a ready access to guns. It's just that there will be violence, including guns.
Short answer, yes.
Yes, to piggyback on what you said, my grandfather used to say this to me when we were little. A spoon can be dangerous. Like my mother would come if I was close to an outlet with a Barbie doll play.
Sure.
You know what I mean? What he meant by that was anything can be dangerous if you utilized in the wrong capacity. So I think I agree that we need to focus on more about the violence and less about what is being used to execute that violence.
Did you come up with a word? It's okay if you didn't.
No, I think I just covered what I said, music, pop culture, this generation, it's symbolism. As I can,
Okay. Well, then we talked about mental health, but nobody suggested that this is an issue of public health. Which is what our Surgeon General just recently this year came up with, is suggesting and emphasizing that what we have in terms of gun violence is actually a public health crisis. And this is an issue, I'm gonna keep going for right now, but I'll open it back up. And this is actually the way that medical professionals and public health professionals for years have looked at gun violence as a public health issue. So to set the stage and just give you some concrete data about the scope of gun violence in our country. At this point, firearms are the leading cause of death for children and adolescents. Okay, up through age 19, that is the leading cause of death, which to me is a shocking statistic. Over the past 10 years, you can see there, fire-related suicides have increased by 20% in the country. And this is particularly significant because suicide is the largest category of deaths from firearms in the country. This to me is a pretty shocking statistic, right? 54% of US adults report that either they, a family member have experienced a firearm-related incident. And we heard this last night, right? Governor Walz was relating that his son was witness to a shooting at a volleyball match. Americans are 25 times more likely to be shot and killed than others in high-income countries. And every day, 327 people are shot in our country. The United States has 121 firearms per 100 residents. That makes us the only country with more civilian-owned firearms than people. Although we hear about mass shootings the most in the news, they actually only make up 1% of all gun violence in America, right? So here is that 60% of gun deaths are from deaths by suicide, and 37% are homicide. And then 3% you have law enforcement involved shootings, accidents, and undetermined. Another really important thing to note, just the same thing as we had in terms of housing. Well, really, this cuts across all of the panels, right? There is inequity in terms of who is suffering the most in terms of this issue, and not surprisingly, it is people of color. So you can see, that demonstrated in this chart, and then the next slide, so a few more statistics that demonstrate, it's people of color who are bearing the burden of most of the gun violence in our country. So the research that I have done with my colleagues is focusing on called a community firearm violence. This is interpersonal violence as opposed to like mass shootings. And we've been focusing on Philadelphia, and we've been looking at how community firearm violence is reported on, how news media in Philadelphia depicts this issue to the public. A lot of the research that we use is really based in framing theory, which is what I'm going to talk to you a bit about today. And we really also look at race, how does race factor into this coverage? And so what I want to suggest to you is something I said at the very beginning, is that the way that we tell stories about events influences the way that we understand issues. Play this short video for you. And I want you to think about what the value of this is. And there should be, oh no, there should be like a field that shows up. Still in the PowerPoint format. So I will just describe what is in this video, if it's not coming up here. But what you will typically see in most news coverage of gun violence is, this is a very short clip. It goes something along the lines of, today in East Germantown, a 26-year-old male was shot at, this such and such location. Police are searching for suspects. Get in contact with police if you have any information. Okay. It's usually very short. And what I've just told you is pretty much what's in it. So what do you learn from a story like that? That information, raise your hand if that information is valuable and helpful to you to know exactly just that little blip that I said. Imagine it's about Bethlehem. Raise your hand if you think that's useful information to your life. Raise your hand if you think that gives you an understanding of gun violence and how it works and why it is so prevalent in society. Does that help you understand the causes or what can be done about it? Raise your hand if you think a story like what I just summarized gives you that information. Okay, not the majority of you. All right, so if you could advance, I guess, 2 slides here. There's an example of a different type of story that I was going to show you that where they had speakers talking about the structural racism and how the inability of a lot of the discrimination in terms of job prospects for people of color affects the incidence of gun violence in areas of our city that have higher rates of unemployment and lower income, right? And so it talks about the root causes of gun violence, one of which is structural racism, right? Raise your hand if you think a clip like that is more helpful to you in understanding why gun violence is perpetuated as opposed to the first story I just described. Right? It's giving you information about the why, right? And then it gives you more information to think about, okay, well, if we want to stop it, how might we stop it, right? And so this has to do with something called framing, which in, the study of media and communication, is how, the content that journalists include in a news story and what they choose to emphasize, but also importantly, what is left out of a story affects the way we as news audiences think about the issue. And so framing in television, you're talking about, there's textual information, verbal information, and visual information. So here, I really like this visual as a way to understand framing, right? If you see this here, you are under the impression that the person on this side of the scene in the camera is attacking the person on the right side. But when the story is framed that way, that's what you see. But when you kind of come out a little wider, now you can see a different picture, right? You see more clearly that it's the person on the left who's attacking the person, right, it's the person right here that's attacking the other person, right? And so this is a good sort of visual example of how framing works, right? Journalists are in charge of showing us as audiences a little piece of the wider story, right? There's no way a journalist can tell you the entirety of something in just a small little story. So they're making choices about what gets prioritized. And so the examples that I gave you that I started out with, that first story is an example of called episodic framing, right? Type of reporting that you see that really just talks about, okay, here is a shooting incident that happened. Here's a little bit of factual information. And now we're going to move on to the next story about a sporting event, for example, right? Or a ribbon cutting. Whereas thematic framing puts that news event into the broader context, right? So it's more like that second clip that I was describing to you, right? That it ties it to a issue of racism. It ties it to issues of, the COVID pandemic that increased rates of gun violence, for example. And so episodic news stories, again, they emphasize just a single event in isolation. And thematic frames connect that single issue to a the broader context. Also, typically in gun violence stories, there's this emphasis exclusively on a crime angle, right? So there's really no discussion, no room for discussions about it being a public health issue or really covering and talking about potential solutions, right? Because it sort of suggests that the only solution, if we look at gun violence just as crime, pretty much follows that the only solution then is going to be policing, incarceration, right? It doesn't leave room for us to imagine the solutions as anything other than that. And a lot of what you see in news coverage is really dependent and reliant on a police perspective, okay? That first clip I was going to show you, all of the information exclusively that's in that story is coming from police sources. Police are telling reporters, here's what happened, and that's it. Whereas the second story looks at people in the community. It looks at experts. There's a community leader that's interviewed in that story, right? You can look to people who are at community organizations who are working in the community. You can talk to the people in the communities that are actually experiencing the highest rates of gun violence because they have an expertise based on their life experiences that is probably more valuable for us to hear than the police perspective, right? And then, a lot of the research has showed that the framing in gun violence reporting is largely, there's very racialized, okay? Television news in particular has a history of overrepresenting the percentages of perpetrators of color, underrepresenting the percentages of victims of color, and producing more sympathetic, more humanizing coverage for white victims. And the effects of this type of framing are victim blaming, right? If gun violence is just a crime story, then the victims are probably at fault for something, right? It reduces support for remedies. It normalizes violence against people of color, right? We come to just expect that people of color just live in places that are somehow inherently violent, and that people of color are also themselves inherently violent, which we know is not true, right? And this leads us to the most pernicious part of the way that we talk about and cover gun violence, which is it dehumanizes and stereotypes people of color. And so the work that my colleagues and I are doing is really to promote this idea of, well, first to sort of study the landscape of, we're analyzing the news coverage itself. And then we've been going and we've been interviewing the people who are the real experts, who have the lived experience, right? So I've conducted focus groups with people in communities in Philadelphia, in neighborhoods and areas that see highest rates of gun violence. One of my research partners is a trauma surgeon, and we interviewed several of her patients who were shot and survived and get their perspectives on, what the media coverage is like. And so in our work, and we do work where we bring community members and journalists together, and all of our work is really geared toward helping journalists understand that we need to produce coverage that doesn't repeat all of those things. And one thing we're suggesting is a public health approach to this, right? Where all of the news stories would be more like that second clip that I showed you, right? Where they provide the context of why gun violence is being perpetuated. Why is it caused? Where they look towards solutions. When people see a story just about gun violence, and when they see story after story after story about gun violence that doesn't focus at all on potential ways to stop the problem, we start to get really hopeless, right? And so you know, including reporting on what people are doing currently to push back and decrease and prevent gun violence, we feel like is really essential. And is in line with what our Surgeon General is advocating for. So you can go back to that. I'm gonna kind of stop there with the slides and just sort of what I want to leave you with is that the result of all of the studies that we have gone out and talked with people who have lived experience with this is not surprisingly, they're, you know, pretty much in agreement that the current way that we cover gun violence in this country is hurtful. They've, you know, the themes that cut across multiple studies with multiple participants is that they feel like it stereotypes and dehumanizes them and their communities. Their evaluations are that the news organizations doing these stories are parachuting into their communities only when negative things happen, and they are, you know, treating these people as commodities, right? So it's the coverage that is produced is dehumanizing and stereotyping, and the interactions people have with journalists in those communities is also extractive and dehumanizing. And the victims who have been traumatized by being shot, then having their stories told in the news and in such a way where it's dominated by police narratives and the victims themselves aren't even interviewed or approached to tell their stories. The biggest takeaway from that whole study was that if they felt like the news coverage was in itself a second traumatic experience on top of the original trauma of being shot, right? So the takeaways here are that, you know, the way that this issue is being framed is not giving audiences really quality information that helps us understand the issue. And it's hurting the people who are suffering the most with the issue. And I hope that kind of this little tidbit and this idea of framing, you know, is something that you can think about and apply to really any of the topics on this panel, right? Because the way that most of us are getting our information about these topics we've all talked about is by watching the news, right? And if you kind of walk away, if the only thing you walk away from what I'm offering here is the idea that like news is framed from a certain perspective and that you have to think not just about what is the perspective that's here, but what is the perspective that's missing, you know, then I'll be happy if that's your only takeaway, because you can sort of apply that way of thinking and being critical about news to any one of the topics we talked about here today, or the myriad topics that are so crucial in the whole election. So thank you so much.
I think those comments were a great way to kind of pull everything together that our panelists talked about today. And I just wanted to take another quick moment to thank all of our panelists for coming today. Lex, you have something you wanted to
Just I'll be quick. Well, I want to echo, yes, thank you so much for being here and providing perspective and data points about many of the issues that are so important to all of you as voters. Obviously, this week we're celebrating National Voter Education Week. This is our third event in a week-long event to help all of you be more educated voters and understand the power of your vote. And I hope from hearing from our panelists today, you understand that with the necessary information, you can make more informed decisions about the candidates and where they stand and who has the real solutions to the problems that people are facing, just even here in our own communities in the Lehigh Valley. Today's theme is making a plan to vote. So make sure that if you're not registered, that you're getting registered today, this week, tomorrow, preferably now, before the October 21st deadline. If you want to vote in person, making sure you know where your polling place is. And even if you think you're registered, checking your voter registration. If you can't vote in person because you might live far away or you have classes or work obligations, we have mail-in voting. So making sure that you're putting in an application for a mail ballot. The deadline is October 29th, but I will tell you as someone who does this work, treat that deadline more like the voter registration deadline and apply for your mail ballot sooner rather than later. And our NCC Votes team is nonpartisan. We don't support any political candidates or parties. We're here to provide you with the necessary information to make sure that you're educated about all of the positions on the ballot. It's not just Kamala Harris and Donald Trump that's up for election this year. You got state house races, attorney general, auditor general, state treasurer, US Congress here in the 7th district, and a US Senate seat. So make sure you're paying attention to what these candidates are saying and getting the resources from us who can provide you with nonpartisan guides about the candidates. Thank you.
So I know that some students are probably going to be on their way to another class, but if you have time to stay, this is the opportunity for a Q&A session informally with the panelists. You can grab a bagged lunch and pull up a chair by one of the panelists who you're most interested in talking to and ask some questions or have a conversation. And thanks again so much for coming today.
I'm gonna be in touch with that.
See how it's done. It's like, I don't do that. I already sent that in.
Thank you. I want to make sure that